The starting point of this tutorial is going to be this pre-made scene provided by Unity. If you look up the Unity Learn site VR development pathway, mission 4, there's this example scene. So I'm going to download, unzip that, and I'll see you in Unity. Now when we're all done, you'll have this knob that you can turn and a button you can push. If you turn it up one click and push the button, one ball comes out. If you turn it up a second click, two balls come out. Third click, 1, 2, 3 balls come out. And a fourth click, 1, 2, 3, 4 balls come out. So it's taking the value of the dial and applying it to how many balls to instantiate or spawn from there. So let's get started. This is our starting point, and if you're getting any of these messages about shadows, resolution, we can resolve that pretty quick. If you go to Edit, Project Settings, go to Quality, you'll see which universal render pipeline it's using, which for me is the middle quality. So if I just go to Project and type in Universal, scrub this down, there's my medium quality, and let's set the Atlas resolution. I can turn this on, and it doesn't like this 512, so I'm just going to throw it up a little higher here. And if we play it and come back, then those messages are gone. So first thing we want to do is create an empty object. I'm just going to right click. Actually, I'll just go to Game Object, go to Create Empty. I'm going to call this Suitor Console. I'm going to put this near the top so I don't have to keep scrolling around. And inside of that is where everything's going to go. So I'm just going to make a cube that is going to act as my, let's call that console cube. That's going to be just kind of the holder of all the controls. And of course you can click here and hit F. Oops, not while you're renaming it. Hit F and it'll take you there. However, I don't want to go that route. There's a fun little shortcut that we can move it right to where we basically want it, which is click it and then Control Shift F, and now it's right basically where I was. And I'm going to zero out rotations here, but that at least moves it into view where we can more or less adjust it. So let me make some quick adjustments. And I'm going to want to make some new folders here. Let's create a folder for materials. I like putting my name on it so I know which ones are my custom one, because some things come with materials folders and scripts folders and things like that. So we'll do a materials and a scripts. And inside that materials, let's just create a quick material. I'm going to make a blue. I'll make this kind of this lighter shade of blue, and we'll drop that onto our cube here. I know I'm going to want to create a yellow, and it's always fun being colorblind trying to figure out what's yellow, but that sounds about right there. And let's create finally a orange, and I think orange is in this category over here. That looks about right. We'll use those in a little bit. I'm also going to grab some custom controls that I found some good 3D models for. I'll show you how to get those quick. So a quick search for VR Human buttons takes you to this vrhuman.com. They provide a nice set of basic dials and switches and buttons that are really nice. So I'm just going to download those straight from the GitHub and extract those and then put them in my Unity project folder so they show up. And then to get them in the correct folder, I like just going to the assets and then show an explorer. And that will take you straight to the correct place. And I'm just going to paste the unzipped group right there. And there's all the buttons and such. So I'm going to go back in Unity. It'll see those and load them up. Now for each one of the objects inside my console, I'm actually going to make an empty for it. You don't want to apply the script to the actual physical 3D model. So I'm just going to create empty, and I'm going to call this button. And I'm going to put container just to be very explicit about what is going on here. And then inside my VR humans, I think it was button 3 I liked. I'm just going to drag that right inside the button container. And we'll move this into position here. Actually, let's do that let's rename it first. Button physical. And I'll fly to where I want it basically, and Control-Shift-F. There's my button. Don't want any of this rotation stuff. The button is quite large. Yes, it is. Hit the R key, and we'll scrub that down. Back to W key. Okay, and then I want another empty on the console. This is going to be the dial container, and then in my knob/dial folder, drag that right onto there. We'll call this dial physical. I'm having trouble. There we go. And let's do the same little Control-Shift-F trick. There it is. Clear out that rotation. There, that looks pretty good. Now, I want to be able to see the knob and which way it's pointing a little nicer, which is why I made those materials earlier. So let's go back into our materials. Let's make it an orange base with a yellow top. Actually, I'm going to swap that, because then I can see the little pointer a little easier. How about that? There we go. Now for our scripts, I'm going to make a brand new script in my scripts folder. Call this my controls 2, because I made one earlier practicing this. And we're going to, after it does this, we're going to drop that right onto the Suitor console, and that's going to control everything for us. You'll notice the physical button here has these different parts to it. That's the, let's call this button top, and button, let's call it button stem. And the dial itself here, that'll be the pointer, and the, I don't know, main dial, let's call it that. Now for our script, let's open that up. Basically, we're going to check and see when we rotate this, we want it to debug log to make sure that's working. And also when we press the button, we have a different debug log. So let's open this up and just create a couple of custom functions to do that. In here, I'm just going to create a public void knob test. Actually, that should be Pascal cased knob test. We're not passing any arguments in there. We'll just say debug log knob turned. And then we'll do another custom function. Call this one button test. We'll just say button pushed. Save that and go back to Unity. Now for the actual the dial itself, the container is where we're going to put the script. So if I add component and just type in knob, there's the XR knob. And actually, if you just type in XR, you can see all the different things there are. There's a grip button, which is, it looks like this, or can look like that, but you have to actually pull the trigger and push it down. We're just going to be using an XR push button. And for this is going to be our XR knob. And real quick overview of what we're looking at it here. The distance calculation mode, you probably want that on collider position, because that's actually what's going to be affected when we rotate it. We don't need a custom reticle. Single is good. The handle is the physical part, right? So that would be the dial physical. And then the value just ranges 0 to 1. So 0.5 would be in the middle between the min and the max angles. So I'm going to start that at 0. Clamp motion just means it's going to listen to the max and min angle. And you'll notice if I put these, let's just put them both at 0 temporarily, it thinks 0 is all the way to the right. So if I want that to be the max, that's fine. My min would just have to be like a negative 180, which means far left. So I can go from 180 and add while I rotate to the far right, which would be 0. The angle increments, that's what it snaps to. In the demo I showed earlier, I just set this to 45. So I'll have 0, 45, 90, whatever the next one is, 180. My math's not good. Position tracked radius. I'm just going to leave that one alone. It seems to work fine. Twist sensitivity. Numbers between 1 and 2 is usually good. It's basically how far you have to physically rotate your wrist before it'll snap to the next increment. If you put this too high, like a 5 or a 10, you'll barely rotate your wrist and it'll snap from the min angle all the way to the max, like all at once. So you want to keep that in the 1 to 2 range. If you feel like you're rotating your wrist too far to actually get the knob to rotate, you can bump it up a number like to 2. So I'm going to leave it at that. And on value change, this is where we're going to run that debug log. So let's go ahead and add one here. And the script is on suitor console, so I want to run something on here. And the function is in the script we attached called my controls. And then we call that custom function knob test. So when we rotate that, that should theoretically debug log something. Now let's go ahead and grab a script for the button. So I'm going to do, sure, XR. And then XR push button is what we want. Now there's two types actually within this one script. There's this type that you push it down and it stays down. That would be using the toggle. I'm going to be using it more like an arcade button where you just push it once, like a momentary switch. So I'm going to leave that unchecked. Similar as before, we're going to be pushing on the collider. So I'm going to leave that alone. Don't need a reticle, single's good. Button, that's where the physical part goes. And oh no, it kind of disappeared, which is not ideal. Actually what I should have done was just zero out the position of the button compared to its parent, and then move the container itself over here. So let's do that real quick. There we go, that's a lot better. The press distance is just what you think it is, how far you push it down before it's activated. I left that alone. The buffer there is if you're using a 2-stage, after you push it down, when you push it again, it actually goes a hair further before releasing back up. We don't even need that because we're just doing a single or a momentary switch. The button offset, so what's interesting is you don't have to add a collider to this. It has this little box, and that's what it's detecting as the collider that your hand controller will push on. Oops, not that. The button offset, I like putting that up a little higher and making this a little bit bigger. Not so much that I hit it with the controller. Let's make this like 0.17. That should be pretty good. And that way, oops, I don't want to move that. The offset there is a little above it, so it's very responsive. Your controller doesn't get buried halfway through the button before it pushes down, I found. And on press, that's where we're going to run our debug log. So our script on the suitor console in my controls is the button test. So let's see what happens. Let's save that and let's get the Quest 2 headset on here. One other issue I just discovered is if you're opening up this new project, you may need to, I'm using the Oculus, so I went to the XR plugin management and checkmarked Oculus. So when I hit play, it actually sends it to my Quest 2 headset that is currently tethered to my PC. Okay, so testing here in Unity, I can tap the left or right thumbstick over to turn in 45-degree increments, and my stuff is too far away, so rather than going out of play mode, back into play mode with making adjustments, one thing I've found is if I kind of prop my headset up on my forehead and grab this suitor console that holds everything, let me put my other controller down here, I can pull this over and then look in the headset as I'm pulling it over and see that it's much better right there, maybe even over a little bit for my headset. That looks pretty good. Now before I go out of here, I definitely want to copy the position of that, because when I hit stop, it goes back, right? So I want that, and then I want to paste position. So now it's in a much better spot. So now let's try it again. And of course, one other thing I forgot about was the button physical needs to have a rigid body and a sphere collider on it, so it knows when your hand is there. So I'm going to add a rigid body, but we don't want gravity, but we do want to still be able to interact with it, so we'll make it kinematic. And then I'm just going to add a sphere collider here, and I don't actually, that actually looks like a pretty good size. Similarly for the dial physical, we'll do, sure. Ooh, it's a little large on that. That looks pretty good. And a rigid body that is just kinematic. Now let's test it. Okay, we're here in VR, and there we go. Ooh, that push distance might be a bit far. It is recognizing it got pushed. So my push distance on the button was way too far. Let's make it like half of that. Let's try that again. And these should clear out. It does say knob turned right when you go in, because it goes from wherever it was to that min position. So it thinks it's already been turned once, but that's okay actually. So the button, that's a lot better. And sure enough, it registered 2 pushes. And the dial, if I can get the mic out of the way. There we go. We can rotate that, and it is recognizing lots of knob turns. But it does go from the far left to the far right, which is exactly what we wanted. So far so good. So now that that works, and actually I'm actually going to move these over a little bit because they're in the way of my mic when I go to play it. Anyways, next let's make a spawn point and then a ball that will spawn, and then we'll make sure that we can actually spawn it. So I'm going to make a new sphere. That's good. That's probably not far from where I want it. Probably want it about, yeah, point. Let's try 0.1. Oops. 0.1. A little small. How about 0.3? That works. Okay. And that's actually not a horrible spawn position. I just want to be able to see it from when I'm pushing the button. That'll work. And I'm going to make a new material here so that I can kind of make it a ghosty look. I'll call this appropriately ghosty. And that color is fine. However, we need to make this, say, transparent so it'll actually listen to the transparency. And that's probably good. Let's apply it and see what it looks like. There we go. We can kind of see through that. So we know where that spawn point will be. And let's put this up here. Let's drop it, make it part of the console. Let's call this spawn location. And then I'm actually going to duplicate that. And we're going to call this the bouncy ball. We need to build it, and then we'll make a prefab out of it. Let's make one more material. Ball. Makes sense, right? Let's make it kind of a blue. I want to be able to see when they rotate too. Let me drop that on there. When it rotates, so I'm going to add a base map on here. And you could bring in a picture or something, but I literally just went through and played around and finally found one that had like some stripey things on it. So I don't know what that ping pong is, but it'll work because I'll be able to tell when it rotates and bounces around. It's a lot easier to see than a solid color ball. So that bouncy ball, we're going to need a rigid body that uses gravity and a collider, which it already has. Actually, now that I think about it, well, let's go ahead and finish this. On the collider here, I want it to actually bounce. So I know it's a physics material, but I'm going to put it inside my materials folder. So physics material, you can just tell it how bouncy something is, basically. Physics material, there it is. We'll call this bouncy high. We'll put this bounciness all the way up to 1. Tell it to multiply on other things it hits. So my bouncy ball here will go in the bouncy high. And right now, if I just play it, it'll hit the floor and just kind of sit there because the floor doesn't have anything on it physics-wise. So if I can find it, there, L walk 1 and 2 are these two parts, the left and right. So I'm just going to put a box collider on there and make a slightly less bouncy one. Let's go down another physics, call this bouncy low. We'll make this, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, something like that. And let's leave it at average and just see what happens. And so L walk 1, oops, I did it on 2. There we go. There's my low there. And let's just copy. Don't want to copy it actually because it'll grab the location of the other one. I think I made that mistake earlier. L walk 1, box collider, bouncy low. So now let's just see, let's collapse some of this stuff. That bouncy ball, let's see how that actually goes when we play it. Let's see how bouncy it is. I don't really need to put on my headset for that. Wow. That's something. And I discovered that for some reason there is a large collider. Oops, it's my box colliders. Whoops. Let's go ahead and drop the center down because it was sitting up on top of everything. Let's put that roughly there. Same for L walk 2. There we go. Now let's test it. See if it bounces. It bounced a little bit, so I'll adjust those a little bit. Let's make this up high too, even though it's averaging the bounce. Ooh, it's actually like flubber. It's actually getting higher and higher. Anyways, you can play around with those values. That'll be fun. Let's leave it alone. Okay, so now we have a ball. We can collapse that stuff. That bouncy ball, we're ready to throw it into a prefabs. Again, I like to make a folder, prefabs, suitor, and I'm just going to drag that ball into there. Very good, save. And I'll just kind of throw this one over here, but we'll be using that prefab. So we're going to need to, on the script here, the suitor console, my control script, we're going to need to tell it when we press this to run a function that will spawn something at this location. So we need to know what we're spawning, where we're spawning it, and we'll just start with that, and then we'll mess with the dial, and that'll control how many actually get spawned. So let's see if we can get the button just to spawn or instantiate something there. So let's go into here, and at the top here, let's do a public game object, bouncy ball, public game object, spawn location, and then we're going to make some new functions here. Public void spawn one ball. Oops. Open closed. And then we want it to instantiate. And then inside of here, we basically need to tell it what, where, and at what rotation. And I typically just go grab from the documentation. So a quick search for Unity instantiate takes me right here to the Unity docs for instantiating or spawning. And here I can see, here's what it's spawning, right? Because it made a game object of that. That's our ball. We're going to tell it where, and then quaternion.identity. It's basically going to take on the rotation of what I spawned. So I'm just going to grab that whole line, go back to our script. Let's just throw that in there. So we're not prefab, we're spawning the bouncy ball. And as far as where, it's not an absolute location. We want to be able to move around that. So we're going to tell it that spawn locations transform dot position, and then we'll leave this alone because it'll just grab whatever rotation this has. So let's say that, save that, and now we have a function that we can call. So let's go back to here, and then in our button here, instead of the test, I'm actually going to take that one out because we know that works. We're going to drop in this and say in my controls, spawn one ball. So in that script, in the console, we need to tell it what the ball is. So from our prefabs, we're going to drop in that prefab. The spawn location, that's our the spawn location thing. That's actually that little sphere right there. And spawn location, that actually doesn't need a sphere collider. That'll knock things all over the place, won't it? And let's test it and see if we can spawn a ball with a button press. Alright, so there we go. Every time I press the button, it does spawn. That push distance is a lot better. The dial will do nothing at the moment. And I'm actually going to make these balls grabbable so that if they stack up like that, I can just pull one out and the whole stack collapses. So let's go to this prefab, collapse that, Let's make this, if I type in grab, there's a XR grab interactable. And I don't think I need to change anything here. I'll just be able to grab it with my raycast pointer. Now we're going to do the coding so that as we turn the dial up, that affects how many balls are spawned when we push the button. A couple of things ahead of time I kind of found out the long and hard way is this dial container, the XR knob, if we actually look at that script, it's in a separate namespace. Now the way I understand namespaces are, I think of them like they're a completely different universe from any other script, and no other script can look at anything else inside the script or look at the values of the knob unless we tell it that we are inside, we want to also have access to that universe or namespace. So I'm going to copy that. You'll see why in a second here. In the My Controls here, we have to tell it, we also want to see into that other universe, right? So we just say, hey, we're also using this custom namespace. That allows us to read the values of the knob itself. And we're going to need a couple more variables here. We're going to need the public game object of the my XR knob, and I'm going to say container so I know exactly what to drop in there because that's what I'm doing. And that knob, remember, has a raw value right here. This value is what we're trying to access. So it goes from 0 to 1. So it's this float that goes anywhere from 0 to 1. And to access that, we're going to want to have a variable to hold that into. So we're going to say a public float. I'll just call it the value or the raw value or something like that. And then we're going to convert that into an int, right? Because we're talking about a number of balls to spawn. So we can't spawn 0.18 bouncy balls. We need to say spawn 1 or 2. So I'm going to convert that into an int with some code, and I'll call this my int value. Now, we really don't need these anymore. Actually, let's clean all this up. Let's take these out. There. It's a lot nicer. We'll put these above this since they're a little more important. And we're going to have a new function that's going to look at the value, convert it to an integer, and then spawn that many. So public void, let's call it spawn knob objects. And inside of that, we'll do a little pseudocoding here, or just commenting, I guess, not pseudocoding. Determine the raw value of the knob's value. So to do that, we're going to say, okay, this value, that float right there, is equal to, and this is where it's really important that we have this, or else, and I found out through many hours of research that I had to actually do this. That's all I had to do. You get to know the easy way. Now we can say it is the my XR knob container. Inside of that, we want to get the component of the script. So we can get the component of its, transform and anything. A script is just a component. So I want to look at its component, and then in carrots, I guess is what we used to call them. The name of that is XR knob, and we're not passing any variable or values there. Dot, and then these are the different options that we can grab, the different components. So you could scroll through this whole list. There's a lot of different things we can grab, but there's one called value. So you can type it in or just do that, semicolon. So if I did a little debug log underneath this, it would just spit out whatever value there is coming from the knob itself. And then, I don't know if this is the most elegant solution, but we're going to basically convert that value to an integer. Now remember, we did this I purposefully set the dial to be in 45-degree increments. And so if I go into play mode and I rotate it, you'll see the angle increments here. Let's look at that real quick. Okay, so I'm in VR here. If I turn it one click and look at the value, you'll see over here it jumped to 0.25 because it's, a fourth of the way to its final. I can click it again and it's at 0.5, sure enough. And let's crank it all the way up and it's at 1. So 0.25, 0.5, 0.75 are going to need to be what we're looking for in the values. So let's go back to our script. And we're going to say if the value, remember that's the value, it just grabbed the raw value from the knob itself. And if it is equal to 0, then we should say, hey, we can now set the int value to 0 because they haven't turned the knob apparently. But there's another scenario. Else if the value is equal to 0.25, and that's a float, then we want to spawn how many? Well, 1, because they moved it up 1 click. So my int value equals 1. I'm just going to copy this for speed's sake. One more actually. So if the value is 0.50, the integer should be 2. If it's 0.75, integer would be 3. And if it's 1, then it should spawn 4 balls. There we go. So we might as well, after all that runs, now would be a good time to run a debug log to see if it actually got it. So let's say my int value translated to, and then concatenate that with my int value. So it's going to spit this value out into the debug log. And actually let's make it even nicer and say from the raw value of space concatenate, and we'll just call this the value. Oops. From the raw value of that. Okay. Let's see what happens now. If we open up our console here, Oh wait, we first have to tell it to run that function, right? Which it's not going to do unless something happens. So the dial container, instead of running that test, we don't need that. Instead, plus, we're going to run something on this in this script. Remember that we named that long function spawn knob objects. That. So that should actually run the script and therefore throw a debug log in there of what values it arrived at. If I move it up, one click, unassigned reference. Oh, rookie mistake. Rookie mistake. Don't forget, you need to tell it what these things are. So the my dial container, knob container is that, and that will allow it to grab those values. Whoops. Let's try that again. Okay. Now, if we move it up one click, my int value translated, there it is, to 1 from a raw value of 0.25. Let's turn it all the way up. And we should, sure enough, 1, then I went to 2 from 0.5, 3 from 0.75, and 4 from 1. Need a space in there, but it doesn't matter. Very good. So now we know we're getting the raw value and we are translating it into an integer that we can then use to spawn that number of balls. Okay, so now we're to the part of the code where we actually want it to spawn the right number of balls based on where the dial position is. So let's go back to our script here. I need to put a space in there because that bothers me. We don't really need that, but so now we're gonna use what's called a coroutine. So it's kind of like a function, except we can control time, like delays in between events, etc. And to start that, IE numerator, and then I don't really know what that means, to be honest. Spawn away, and then here we go. We don't really need to debug log here, but we might as well, just so we know. Oh, that one's already being used in a script. That's why it doesn't like that. Oh, that'll go away in a little bit, actually, when we put in a little bit of time control here in a second. So don't worry about that for now. Let's do a debug log that says ran coroutine with a my int value of quote concatenate my int value. So we'll see when the coroutine actually starts. It'll log it to the console. And we're going to use a for statement so we can control how many times this runs. So a for statement, this is a new concept, at least for the videos I've done. We can say for as long as the condition is true, do the following, is essentially what it is. So we write a new integer, usually just I, and pretend I just said 3. There's 3 parts to a for statement. For I equals 3, we're going to start I at that. As long as I is greater than 0, semicolon, do something, and then subtract 1 from I, this is shorthand for saying I equals I minus 1, right? So we can just say I minus minus. And then, so as long as that's true, we could say debug log hello. There we go. So the way this would work is I starts at 3. Is 3 greater than 0? Yes. Go run this once. Subtract 1. Now I is 2. Is 2 greater than 0? Yes, it does. So it goes and runs that twice. Subtract 1. Is 1 greater than 0? Yes, it is. Go run it. Subtract 1. Now I is 0. Is 0 greater than 0? No. And so it ran it the 3 times, and then it would exit and run the next chunk of code, whatever we put down there. So we don't want I to always be 3. we want it to be what? We want it to be the integer value, right? Because that's how many times it's going to spawn something, right? So instead of that, we're going to say spawn bouncy balls with delay. So instead of just setting I to 3 hard-coded number, we're going to say, well, whatever my int value is. So if they cranked it up to 4, right, they cranked it all the way to the right, I would equal 4. Is 4 greater than 0? Yes, it is. So run this code, and then subtract 1 to 3, then 2, then 1. So it'll run it 4 times, which is exactly what we want. So what do we want to do each time it iterates through this for state? We want to say instantiate, and here we're going to say, what are we spawning? Well, remember from our little demo here, we want it to spawn the bouncy ball. And where do we want it to spawn? Well, basically right here. We really want to get lazy with it. And I'm pretty sure I'll misspell that. So we'll throw that in there. So it's going to instantiate the bouncy ball at the spawn location, that little ghosty sphere that we made. And then after it spawns, if I leave it alone, it'll spawn all 4 really fast. So I'm going to tell it, hey, why don't you wait a half second before you do this again? So you just type in yield return new, wait 4 seconds. I'm going to say 0.5f. You can make it whatever the delay you want between the spawnings. That's what you put there. And we might as well do a little debug log. That's fun. Spawns left :space. And then let's see what it does if we put in my int value, because it should be decreasing within this coroutine. I'm not sure it's going to like that or not, but let's see what happens. Cool. Let's see if that actually works. It should work, right? It'll work. I'll run this in focused view again so that we can see the console. And actually, I'm going to take out these debug logs because that's really going to clog up our console. So let me take that out real quick. Yeah, every time we change the knob, right? Let's take out all these debug logs because we know that works. That we want, that we want. Let's do that. Actually, we took all the other ones out already, so that's pretty good. Okay, so now when we run it, theoretically, who knows, right? Okay, here we are. Console is up. Let's turn here. Whoops. Let's crank that up to the second knob spot and hit the button. 1. Oh, it only spawned 1. Does anyone know why? I feel like I'm teaching my high school class. Well, we told it to, when we push the button, to do what? Spawn 1 ball. Well, that's not right. We don't want it to do that. We want it to... Oh, actually, there's another mistake I made. Hold on. We gotta go back to here. This, we're going to tell it to run this, which is going to get the values, right? And translate the values correctly. Problem is, this is never called. This never gets told to run. So when should that get told to run? Well, once it has this raw value and it converts it into an integer, then we should run our fancy little coroutine down there. So you literally just say start coroutine, and then the name of it, spawn away 2 with empty parentheses, and then the closing parenthesis, and a semicolon. So if you don't have that in there, it's never going to jump down here and do all this fun stuff. So we'll save that, go back. Let's go here, let's crank this up to 2. Well, now that's an issue, isn't it? It ran every time I turned the dial, which could be an issue, although it's really fun. So obviously we did something else wrong. Let's look here. the dial container. Ooh, every time we turn the knob and it runs that like 100 times. Yeah, we really don't want that. In fact, we don't need the knob to run anything, because the button here that has this script, that's where we need to say from the Studer console, my controls spawn knob objects. Only when we push the button, not when we rotate the knob, because for some reason that runs like 100 times every time you rotate it. So that was fun, but not quite correct. Let's try this again. So let's turn the knob up to 2 and push the button. Hey, 2 balls spawned, and I can grab these now and throw them because I made them grabbable. Let's crank it up to 3. Push the button. 1, 2, 3. Get out of here, balls. Get out of there. All the way up to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each separated by a half second. Hey, ta-da! It works. Ta-da! We can push this a whole bunch of times if we want, and it's still lots of fun. There we go. So hopefully that's helpful, and you can then, of course, if a user was going to use this, you would probably want to use a graphic, or you could even just do a canvas and put some text in there so they know what those dial positions are, and maybe a little explanation of what the button does, but you can do that on your own. So hope this helps someone, and have a good time. Bye.